My name is Rabbi Bert Visotsky. I'm the director of the Louis Finkelstein Institute for Religious and Social Studies here. And I am a professor here now, and I've been here 2/3 of my life. This panel is called GenNext, Religious Leadership 40 and Under. So let me begin with a confession. I'm over 40. I know you wouldn't know it to look, but I actually am. In fact, I've been at JTS almost 40 years. So, which, you know, that's a question of my karma, I suppose, more than anything else. But because I direct the Institute, and because I know so many fine religious leaders who actually have different kinds of religious leadership, whether some are in bricks and mortar, some are doing piecework, some are about to finish their doctoral dissertations, and you know, some are in the band. So I wanted to have an event where we can explore the different modes of leadership, and I want to also say that one of our panelists who we were very much anticipating and who was very much involved and wanted to be part of this tonight, called me this afternoon just really sick with the flu, and she just was out of it. So I feel terrible that Valerie Carr is not here. A, because we will miss her, but also because she's really home feeling lousy. So those of you who are friends or fans of hers, give her a day or two to recover and give her a call and let her know you're thinking about her. But I'm very happy, first of all, not only for you who are here, because there is music tonight, I wanted to actually combine, because I actually think music is incredibly powerful. One of our great teachers here at the Jewish Theological Seminary, Abraham Joshua Heschel, wrote as follows: while other forces in society combine to dull our mind, music endows us with moments in which the sense of the ineffable comes alive. And I must say that the band that's here tonight, Girls in Trouble, really kind of embodies that. So we have this fabulous panel of great religious leadership, and we have this incredible band that will be playing downstairs after the panel. And when that's done, I'll direct you down there. But we're going to begin by, first, let me welcome you again. And apropos the band being here, I'm very pleased to acknowledge the presence of a member of another great band from back when Alan Cooper of Shanana is here. You have to be, grateful for your gifts, Alan. It happens. Alan Cooper is also a professor of Bible at the Jewish Theological Seminary. I'm going to invite our panelists, actually, to kind of tell their story, because each of them came to their leadership roles in very different ways. So I'm going to give fairly brief introductions of who's who on the panel, and then I will invite each of them to share their story. And when that's done, I'm going to pick on people and make them respond to questions they may not otherwise want to answer. But on my far left, the Reverend Elizabeth Garnsey. Elizabeth is a graduate of the Yale Divinity School, and she is an Episcopal priest at the Church of the Holy Rest. Did I get that right? Heavenly Rest, yes, and the founder of the cafe, the Heavenly Rest Stop, on the east side of New York. Harun Mogul is the fellow who's just about to finish his doctoral dissertation. Will that help?
Maybe.
He is a leader of a number of Islamic communities. He has a very strong online presence. It's called The Maidan, is that? And is actually a wonderful blogger, a novelist, a writer, and really a model of a outside of the mosque Islamic leader. And immediately to my left is Rabbi Melissa Weintraub. Melissa is a graduate of the Jewish Theological Seminary, where she was ordained, and she is the founder and North American director of the Encounter programs, which bring American Jews together with Palestinians so that they can hear the Palestinians' narratives in their own voice. And I'm going to start actually with Melissa and invite you to share how you came to be the rabbi that you are.
Wonderful. Well, I'm delighted to be introduced by Bert Vysotsky, who is my mentor, rabbi, teacher, friend, one of the reasons that I made it through the seminary, and it's wonderful to be back up here after a few years' absence and to see all of you. So I'm going to tell my story in 6 snapshots, how a Jewish girl from the Midwest ended up shuttling between rabbinical school and Palestinian front stoops. Culminating in the creation of Encounter, which is the organization I co-direct, which represents the most significant non-military Jewish presence in Palestinian areas of the West Bank in the last decade. So the first snapshot, mid-'80s. My mother is driving 3 hours to the closest kosher meat markets outside of central Illinois, where I grew up. And my father is patiently sweeping into my elementary school to explain, yet again, that singing songs about Christ our Savior is neither neutral nor inclusive. And my parents are really modeling for me how to be a minority, how to be different gracefully, how to sustain what I call bifocal vision, to really be immersed in, steeped in the norms and assumptions around me and simultaneously to be able to see beyond them. I am an ardent Zionist from early childhood, having grown up in this town where anti-Semitism was still alive and well, and we really perceived Israeli tanks as protecting us, even here in the American heartland. But still, Israel is basically a perceived vacation destination and a slightly less attractive one than Cancun or Tuscany. And despite the fact that Israel holds a kind of mythic, if not salvific allure, no one in my immediate family has ever actually been there. Second snapshot, I'm now a starry-eyed sophomore in Harvard Yard. And by this time, like many in our generation, I'm fond of characterizing my identity with prefixes like post and multi. I dedicate my extracurricular hours to tutoring inmates in prisons, working with Native Americans in North Dakota, and Latinos in the Bronx, and African Americans on the south side of Chicago, basically immersing myself in every community but my own. And when, to use Heschel's term, the ineffable draws near in the middle of the night, and I find myself restored to the spiritual intuitions of my childhood despite the enlightened skepticism of my teenage years. It's not to Judaism that I turn for nourishment or to take me deeper on my path. Soon I'm studying Buddhist texts and reading Christian mystical poetry. I'm learning to meditate in multiple traditions and dancing with neo-pagan feminists beneath the moon. When I hear a Jewish-born Buddhist nun say that she became a Buddhist because, in her observation, being Jewish meant rooting for a football team, whereas being a Buddhist meant striving to be a good person and alleviate the suffering of all human beings, I thought then that she was right. Third snapshot, 1996. Within days of my first visit to Israel, I defy all warnings against travel to the West Bank and find myself initiated into my first confrontation with Palestinian experience. And now I'm sitting in the Birzeit University cafeteria. Birzeit is the largest Palestinian university in the West Bank. I am watching women in hijab and men in tight jeans with slick hair, debating democracy and freedom and Palestinian political factions in a class on Chaucer and Beowulf. And I'm sitting in the Birzeit cafeteria recording stories for no one in particular, the stories of Palestinian men and women, stories that have never left me. Fourth snapshot, still 1996. I'm sitting in a Jerusalem cafe with my then boyfriend, and he's trying to convince me to join him in his new zeal for the Jewish bookshelf. He says, "Do you really think that your ethical and spiritual and intellectual sensibilities are so discontinuous from those of your ancestors And don't you think there need to be peace activists who can speak in Jewish terms? I'm really not ready for this message, but it sort of sings back to me a few years later when I am ready for it. And I end up in Jerusalem for 3 more years studying Jewish thought, mysticism, law, and eventually even opening the Bible. And falling in love with Jewish tradition on its own terms on an unpredicted journey to becoming a conservative rabbi. Fifth snapshot, summer of 2004, fast forward many years. I'm moderating a panel called Personal Narratives on Israel at a Jewish Young Leadership Conference. On the chair to my left, there is a speakerphone, emitting the broken up, disembodied voice of a Palestinian nonviolent activist named Rassan Andoni, whom I've known for nearly a decade. I rallied for Rassan's presence at this institute, but in the end, we weren't able to obtain a visa for him. And I spent much of that conference wondering how things might have been different if Rassan had been able to mingle with the rising Jewish stars around me in the dinner line and on informal walks through free time. A few weeks later, I attend a Christian peacemaking conference with several nuanced and brilliant Palestinian speakers, and only one Israeli on the docket, an American-born woman who condemns the violence and militarism of Israeli society in quasi-dehumanizing terms. I spend much of that conference thinking about how the Israeli-Palestinian conflict is reproducing its black and white polarized logic here. How those who care deeply about the conflict are retreating into echo chambers, talking past one another, self-certain and incomplete. Sixth and final snapshot. It's now fall of 2004. I'm shuttling yet again between Palestinian NGOs and rabbinical school, JTS's counterpart in Jerusalem, where I am studying in my 4th year as a rabbinical student. And I've gotten to the point that I can walk into a Jewish young leadership or a Palestinian young leadership conference and know as many people in each room. I know that in both places, people are mutually obsessed with each other with very little exposure to each other's basic humanity or lived experience. So that fall, I lit Shabbat candles in Beit Zahor, a Palestinian village outside of Bethlehem, with a group of Palestinian activists and my dear friend, Rabbi Miriam Margles, and we began to dream another dream. We dreamed of bringing everyone we knew, including those most cynical, to come and sit around that table with us. We dreamed that the most influential Jewish leaders, executives, and board members of major Jewish organizations, philanthropists, rabbis, Jewish educators, Israel lobbyists would sit down together in front of the separation barrier with Palestinians directly impacted by it and grapple together with what it means. We dreamed of creating a web of communication that would connect influentials across the conflict in moments of crisis like the flotilla incident, Orthodox rabbis and anti-occupation activists, AIPAC and Peace Now donors, J Street didn't exist then, would be able to call each other up, as well as PLO leaders and nonviolent activists before hardening into entrenched positions and blame games. We dreamed of a new paradigm that would transform the all-or-nothing logic that divides the world into pro-Israel and pro-Palestinian, good Jews and bad Jews, us reasonable people who are fighting the good fight, and those brainwashed loonies who just don't get it. We dreamed that overhauling this polarized conversation within the Jewish community and the broader American public might be one key to transforming the Israeli-Palestinian conflict as a whole. So we began in March of 2005 with a busload of rabbinical students from every seminary and several Orthodox yeshivot, every denomination. Our participants returned to Jerusalem using words like life-changing and mind-blowing, so we organized another one and another one, not knowing we were starting a movement. And now we are more than 1,000 leaders, 40 trips later. AIPAC staff have slept in the homes of Palestinians and stayed up all night poring over maps and histories. Orthodox yeshiva students have prayed in the homes of former Palestinian militants. Jewish leaders who had previously only met each other in rival op-ed pages or protests have apologized to each other for shutting each other down. Philanthropists have changed their funding priorities, begun funding Palestinian and Israeli organizations they newly see as part of the solution. There's a wonderful TED Talk by the Nigerian author Chimamanda Adichie, The Danger of a Single Story. Has anyone seen this talk? No? Adichie basically describes the danger of talking about any group as if they are one thing and one thing only. She talks about, she says, the consequence of the single story is this: it robs people of dignity. It makes recognition of our equal humanity difficult. This conflict is full of single stories. There's the single story of Palestinians as violent, uncompromising, nihilistic, Jew-hating, hell-bent on our destruction. And there's the single story of Palestinians as one-dimensional victims, removed from all agency and culpability. There is the single story of Israelis as callous and aggressive military brutes, impervious to any suffering but their own. And there's the single story of Israelis as heroic, blameless, and morally superior victims. And there are all the single stories that we within the American Jewish community impose on one another from every side of the political spectrum: self-hating, extremist, naive, bigoted, brainwashed, bonkers. The heart of my life's work is prying open all of these single stories, the temptation to caricature or dismiss our political opponents, even our enemies, in categorical terms, hardening against the genuine integrity, complexity, and concerns of those with whom we disagree. Gandhi once remarked that it's only in facing the other in political conflict that the possibility for genuine transcendence arises. It's only in political conflict and facing the other in political conflict that the possibility for genuine transcendence arises. There's a Jewish mystical teaching that the holiest human act, the highest realization of the human condition lies in the harmonization of polarities. We're charged with achdut hanigudim, right? The reconciliation of opposing forces, masculine and feminine, light and darkness, expansion and restraint. Martin Buber, building on these ideas, teaches that we affirm God's unity not by professing it, right? Not just by naming that God is one, but rather by fulfilling God's oneness. Through healing the world's most primal rifts and monstrous contradictions. Last year, a woman that some of you may know, a former JTS student named Ariel Cohen, traveled to Bethlehem for the first time. Ariel grew up in an Orthodox world in Baltimore, and she was scared to death to travel to Bethlehem, so scared that on the way she asked herself, why the heck am I doing this? Is it really worth the fear? Her answer to herself was, I know Palestinians are human beings, but I just don't feel it. I don't really feel it in my kishkas, in my gut. At one point, we were walking down the street, and I noticed tears kind of trickling down Ariel's cheeks, and she said, you know, I've lived here off and on for a decade, and I had no idea there's a whole other country here. This is the Twilight Zone. There's a whole other country here. And just as she said this, a church bell rang over her head. This is Bethlehem. And it was really deafening. It was so loud we couldn't speak for a minute. And she said, you know, I think I've heard the echo of that bell in Jerusalem, but everyone around me told me I was hallucinating. And I'm just going to have to keep coming back and keep coming back, because now that I'm here, this is unmistakable. There's no denying that bell. And I'm just going to have to keep coming back until there's no dissonance, no clash of awareness, and being able to hear and grapple with what's happening on both sides of the barrier with empathy and concern. I think of Ariel every day when I say Patach Libi, open up my heart in my prayers. I think of Ariel's wish for a heart that can hold the contradictions and claims, the passions and fears of multiple parties to this conflict. I think of two enemies standing before each other, telling their stories, heavy doors and closed, scared hearts swinging open. Shafachnu kamayim avnei libot, we have poured out our stone hearts like water. That is my Jewish path and prayer.
Thank you. Haroon. I'm sure Haroon will not thank me for having to follow Melissa, but go for it.
Good evening. Thank you, everyone, for coming out, and thanks for organizing, and it's a great panel to be on. I was asked to talk a little bit about how I got to where I am, and as I thought about it, I realized I don't know, both in a deep existential sense and in an actual what was I doing 2 hours ago sense, which I think it seems to be pretty common to most aspiring academics. I'm sure for those of you who've either gone through the path or are on the path right now, that feeling when you return a book to the library and momentarily, right before you put it in the slot, you think to yourself, what did I just read? And was there anything in there I should remember? Because there's nothing in my head right now. And that's happened probably 2,000 or 3,000 times. So keep that in mind if you ever hear me at a job talk. I guess to start the story, when I came to college, I went to NYU as an undergraduate, and I've been in the city now on and off for about 12, 13 years. I decided to go to NYU because I didn't get into an Ivy League university as my parents expected and demanded from the age of 2 days. Which, for those of you who have a South Asian background, if you don't become a doctor, I mean, why even try anything? I'm not, it still hurts, but I'm just kidding. And, my brother went to Penn, and I assumed that I would go to Penn because he had gone to Penn, his wife had gone to Penn, her brother had gone to Penn, so I figured, what's the problem? And I got the rejection letter dated April 1st, 1998, and I thought, that's very funny. Where's the real letter? But it actually was the real letter, so thank you, Penn. I turned them down when it came time to get a PhD, and I crossed that no very furiously and happily, but I don't think they care. In case they're listening, though, it's just so they know. And I got to NYU, and I was in an interesting situation because I came from a family that was very religious and very conservative, which means that growing up, I learned a lot of things about my religion factually, without necessarily knowing them experientially, without necessarily knowing them spiritually. So for those of you who come from a Muslim or Jewish background, I'm sure you can understand exactly what I mean, where I was familiar with the text, I was familiar with the terminology, I was familiar with the language and the ritual. I could give a sermon, I could speak Arabic with an Arabic accent, although I'm not of Arab background. And all these things gave me a certain facility and also put me into a certain situation of expectation and responsibility, in part because the existing religious architecture of Islam in the United States is in many cases very underdeveloped and really stretched thin. So for anyone who sort of knows what's going on and can also communicate that in English, one can very quickly find oneself deluged with requests and so on and so forth. So I found myself in this weird position where I was going to NYU and I didn't really know what I was supposed to do with myself or what my identity was as a Muslim, but I sort of fell into a leadership role where people said, hey, you know how to give a sermon, there's only like one other person who does, so you should do the sermon, or you know what this is or you know what that is, so why don't you do this or that? And I started studying Arabic in my freshman year, formally, and I had been studying it earlier, and I had a good time, I was enjoying myself, things were great, but I didn't know what I wanted to do with myself. I got into NYU deciding that I wanted to study theoretical physics. That didn't work out. Then I decided I wanted to be an English major. That's cool. I thought I would do economics. I didn't do very well in my intro to econ class, so I decided I would not do economics. This was very traumatizing for my parents, who were observing from a distance thinking, what the heck is wrong with this kid? Because if you change your major ever, that's a problem. Medicine was not in that scenario. And I think out of a sense of confusion and also restlessness, when I was basically in my third year at NYU, I decided to go to Egypt. I decided to go to Cairo to study Arabic, but also because I wanted to study abroad, I wanted to do something different. Shortly before I left, I was elected president for the coming year of the Muslim Students Association at NYU, which is known as the Islamic Center at New York University. And I didn't really know what to make of that either. There were a lot of things I wanted to do with the Islamic Center, but for me it was much more of an administrative role and a vision role as opposed to a deeply religious role, insofar as I wanted to take the community somewhere and thought I could do that in an external sense, if that makes sense. And I went to Egypt. I had a great time. I did everything except study Arabic. This was exceptionally traumatizing to me in many senses because I found myself in Egypt not to be what I thought I would be. I assumed that I would be in Egypt and I would go to all the mosques and I would inundate myself with a sort of traditional Islam, and yet I found myself hanging out in certain neighborhoods like Ma'adi and Aguza and these different neighborhoods, which are sort of the more westernized faces of Egypt. I continued studying Arabic. I loved visiting the Islamic history and heritage. I found a mosque that I really enjoyed. Actually, the preacher at the mosque is a man named Amr Khalid, who was one of the most, and is one of the most famous Muslim, I guess for lack of a better term, televangelists. I had no idea. I just found his Arabic easy to understand and sort of compelling, so I thought, why not go there? He was able to pronounce the jim as a jim and not as a gim, so for someone who studied Arabic formally, it was very fun. And I wrote a novel when I was in Egypt. Eerily enough, in my novel, having sort of felt the frustrations of people there, I centered my novel around young men who lit themselves on fire to protest what was happening in the region, and did so in order to start a revolution, which means that I predicted everything. And one day I will be recognized for my prescience. That day is not today, but you heard it here first. And when I came back to NYU, I came back very different. I loved Egypt, I loved Arabic, I enjoyed the Arab world, but it was not in a way that I thought I would. And the third day of classes as a senior, as president of the Muslim Students Association at NYU, I got out of the subway. I was going to Persian class. Having gone through all the Arabic classes, I thought, why not try another one? And I got out of the subway, and someone pointed out that the World Trade Center was on fire. And I looked up and asked, everyone was congregated on the corners of the streets in little clusters stepping off the sidewalks, and I asked what happened. And someone said a plane had flown into one of the towers. And I think like pretty much everyone else in the city that day, I assumed it was an accident. What else would I think it was? I assumed it was some sort of amateur pilot or small plane that had hit the tower, and certainly it was on fire, and I was very stunned by that, but didn't really know what to do, so I went to class. And the class was in the basement down in the Village, NYU campus, and someone came down about half an hour later and said, the second tower has been hit. And it took me about 2 seconds to process what had happened, and another 2 seconds to process that in my head the image of Osama bin Laden immediately appeared. I was a Middle Eastern Studies major, so I knew enough of what was going on. And then another second later processed that I was the president of the Islamic Center at New York University. We were within walking distance of the World Trade Center. We got out of class, like anyone else who lived in New York that day, a mixture of panic, confusion, anxiety, a desire to help, a desire to do something, without really knowing what one could do. We got a group of people together and we decided to walk down to what we now call Ground Zero on the assumption that we could do something to help. And when we got to Canal Street, there was a wall of smoke on the south end of the street, and people were coming out of the smoke, and someone said to me, "Where are you going?" And I said, rather unthinkingly, "I'm going to help," and kind of looked at me, "What do you think you're going to do? We all need to go that way," meaning north. And that was really, for me, when my life was forced to go in a different direction. And I don't mean it out of a sense of negative obligation, but in a sense that whatever I had wanted to do, it didn't really matter anymore, because I would have to move things in a different direction because of who I was and what I knew and what role I was in. I spent the next year doing interviews and talks for every possible media agency you can imagine, from Brazil to Japan to Germany, many of which were not published in English. So I'm certain that maybe one of them wrote something that I didn't mean to say. So if you never see me again and my career goes down the toilet, now you know why. But it was really out of the sense that someone has to say something, and people were looking for someone to talk. And there we were, that close to Ground Zero, where the assumption was you talk. And for me, I think something that sticks into my mind to this day after the attacks on September 11th, campus was closed. And campus was closed, obviously, that Tuesday through that Friday. And then starting on Monday, you could go down below 14th Street if you produced an ID or some proof of residence or an NYU ID saying that you were a student. And I went down, I remember, on a Wednesday, which was exactly 8 days after the attacks, and NYU's Middle Eastern Studies department had rather hurriedly put together a talk in their main arts and sciences building on the Middle East and the politics of the Middle East, much in the manner that after everything that's been happening in the Middle East today, you have these panels put together and they're very well attended because people want to know what the heck is going on, why did this happen, how can I make sense of what's happening. And I went down about 45 minutes early. You can ask my wife. I'm famous for being the only South Asian who's ever on time. It's a curse because nobody else is ever on time, which means I have lots of time to not write my dissertation because I'm waiting for someone. If you're in this room, I'm not bitter, but I will never hang out with you again. And I got down there 45 minutes early on the assumption that there's going to be a lot of people there, so let me get down there early so I can get into the room. And when I got down there, there were easily 1,000 people outside the building waiting to get in, and it was pretty obvious that they would not be allowed in because there were just so many people. And again, maybe the event started at 6:30, it's 5:45 p.m., and there's just no way. And it's Washington Place, and there were these big planters where they put the trees in, maybe about 2 or 3 feet off the ground. And I thought to myself, and at this time, I hated public speaking. I hated being in front of people. I never wanted to be in that situation. It always made me tremendously nervous. But I thought to myself in my head that I want to climb onto this planter and say to people, this is who I am. My name is Haroon. I'm the president of the Islamic Center. I'm a Middle Eastern Studies major. If you have any questions, I would like to answer them. Because I felt it was my obligation as a Muslim, as someone who studied the region, who had some sort of role to do something, to say something, to answer some people's questions, and to offer something different than what people were now associating with, frankly, who I was and everything I knew growing up. And I didn't do it. I don't know why I didn't do it. I don't know how I would have been received had I announced myself to be the president of the Muslim Students Association at NYU. I mean, these are all hypotheticals, but to this day, I deeply regret not having done that. And for me, this is what came up when Bert asked the question, what brought you to where you are? And for me, it was really that moment and that sense that whether or not we want to be in a certain role, sometimes circumstances around us and events that are much larger than us force us to go in certain directions and do certain things. And that is not to say that I resent them, but rather that we find our lives sometimes taking courses very different than we intended them to. And that is what has really led me as a young Muslim, or youngish Muslim, to really do what I do. So thank you.
Thank you, Haroon. I want to say a word about Elizabeth Garnsey because she's a good friend of mine, and I'm glad because I put her in this untenable position. Elizabeth was supposed to be our moderator tonight, and when Valerie called sick, I called Elizabeth and said, please do me the favor of being a panelist, and I'll pretend to be under 40 and be the moderator. So Elizabeth has not had a lot of time to think this through except for her daily and nightly thinking, how did I get to be an Episcopal priest? Please, Elizabeth, share with us your story.
I'm going to turn a little bit. Everyone's on one side, just like church. Well, thanks, Bert, for having me. And actually, it's a pleasure to be here. And I was really looking forward to meeting Valerie, too. And I'm no Valerie, and I'm no Melissa or Haroon. But I'm delighted to be here. And I do represent, the sort of bricks and mortar parish setting as a church leader. And my story is I grew up in Colorado. And my parents had roots in New York and Chicago and Colorado, and very solid white Americans, Republicans, and I have 2 sisters, and my parents were kind of nominal Episcopalians. When I say that, I mean they're the kind that went to church and watched and then went home. And they had a moment probably in the late 70s when they began to get sort of hungry for more experience in their spiritual lives. And our Episcopal church was typical of the time, and it was very clerical, and the priest there was not interested really in allowing lay people to participate. And At that time there wasn't a Buddhist meditation center or a yoga studio in every corner. So when people hungered for experience, where I grew up, you went to the Pentecostal church. And so my parents had friends who were starting to do this, and they invited my parents to a couple of Bible studies and things like that. And my Episcopal church experience was really fantastic for children. We had great Sunday school, and I loved the stories, and it was very rhythmic and methodical, and there were colors for every season. There were a lot of symbols, and it was tangible. And when we say incarnation, we mean like everything concrete has some holy symbolism. And bread and wine and water and oil really meant something, and we learned that as children. And I loved it, and I loved our priest, and our priest's wife was a very dramatic woman with black hair and very pale white skin, and she wore red lipstick, and her clothes always matched the season. She wore purple in Lent and green in ordinary time, and red on Christmas. And for me, it was a very visual, very tangible rhythm of life that I appreciated, and I was very upset, actually, at age 12 or 13 when my parents decided to up and move us out of that church and go to the Pentecostal church. And the Pentecostal church was new in town, and it was in a warehouse on the outside edge of town. And I grew up in the agricultural urban center of northern Colorado, which means a small town that serviced all the farmers that lived far away. And my dad was a car dealer, so he sold trucks and tractors to all the farmers. And so the outside of town meant out in the country. And there was a band in the corner, and the pastor had a mic without a cord, and he'd walk through the congregation and put it in your face if you weren't singing. He'd sort of egg you on to sing, and he was trying to see also who might be speaking in tongues. And there was a lot of frenzy involved in the experience. And there's a spectrum. When I describe this is my local place that my experience was, but I think there's a spectrum of church experience, and some are quite great and healthy, but this one seemed very manipulative to me and traumatizing. So in my experience, my parents really enjoyed the awakening, and they had an emotional experience and an emotional connection to what they were going through at the time. And the Sunday school, the tradition of Pentecostal church in that place followed the line of very individualistic theology and the dispensationalist ideas of rapture theology, and that the advent of the church was sort of a new dispensation where Jesus, the plans were being laid for Jesus to come back, with each dispensation. And a lot of the people in our church were Christian Zionists and very aligned with AIPAC, and traveling to the conventions, and involved in Washington, and wearing pins on their lapel with Israel's and American flags, and really hardcore people. And we had one Sunday school teacher who carried around a Schofield Bible, and it was annotated with dates and events in history that lined up with predictions in the prophets and in the book of Revelation, and it was heavy duty. So I never really embraced any of that, and I felt really, really traumatized, and so every Sunday became a war between my mother and I about me not wanting to go, and her saying, well, you're going to miss your miracle. And I really was quite an experience. So by the time I was 18, I could go to college and never go to church again, and that's just exactly what I did. So I appreciate now their hunger for experience, and but I did grow up at an early age exposed to what I now feel was a very, very damaging experience in a tradition that is really one of the dominant voices in American Christianity, and many people don't realize how influential that sect of Christianity is in politics and in the wider culture. When I come across certain things in the news, they resonate maybe more with me than some other people. For example, last week there was an article in the Times about a naval officer, a young guy, age 25, who had achieved the unachievable of getting honorable discharge for being a conscientious objector. And he had to argue his case hard towards the Navy, and they refused him twice, and he took it to federal court. But as a teenager, he felt an obligation to serve his country, so he chose the Naval Academy over many full-ride scholarships he could have taken at other colleges. But during his training at the academy, he began to study his Christian faith, and he joined a Quaker community, and which are a pacifist tradition, and he also learned Hebrew. He wanted to read the Hebrew scriptures in the original, and he really worked at learning his faith and figuring it out. He studied just war theories of Augustine and Aquinas. And so in this article, it told about how the Navy challenged him on his faith and said, I'm not, how are your pacifist views in line with mainstream Christianity, conservative Christianity? And just even the question to me is unthinkable why is that a good question? And it is because mainstream Christianity in America is not at all pacifist. And I think, in the military, statistics say most of the people in the military are mainstream conservative Christians. And they probably are more like the group I grew up with than this guy in his Quaker community. So, that's the dominant voice. And there are many, many, many other kinds of Christians, but they're the ones with the power and the money. And so I feel that, having grown up in that tradition, I've always been sort of reactionary against the alignment of politics and Christianity as I've experienced it. My grandparents, I should mention, were politicians in Colorado, and they were both in the legislature, and in our house, God was a Republican and God was an American. So, I flailed around in college and afterwards and didn't join any kind of community. I really rejected my Christian upbringing, and I didn't ever feel I was rejecting God or my sense of a higher power or my own sort of faith, inner prayer practice, whatever that was. I felt like I was talking to God, and I was usually screaming at God and wondering why my parents were so crazy. And they were not crazy, and they're not now. But I felt what they did, was a big experiment that failed, and I felt that I paid a price. And so I went to college at CU, Colorado University in Boulder, and I connected with a political science professor and became his teaching assistant in the study of Soviet satellite countries. And this was around close to '89 when the Berlin Wall was coming down, and it was an exciting time, but we studied fascist and totalitarian ideologies, and some of the imagery of those studies included, Nazi rallies and how music would play and the troops would march in and a helicopter would bring in the leader, and that frenzy of whipping up people's emotions always harkened back to me the experience I had in church of being whipped up into an emotional situation, and the people sort of becoming addicted to that and needing to rally around that theology. So I always was a little preoccupied with my upbringing. And after college, I worked in Washington, D.C. for a senator there, and from there I went to France and became a journalist, and I worked for the Associated Press television and then on the print desk for a while. And then I returned to New York, and I worked at George Magazine and Travel and Leisure as a writer and editor. And at that time, coming back to New York, I felt like I was sort of putting roots down and trying to figure out who I was and what I was going to do with my life. And I also, every time I'd visit home, and I tried to avoid being there on Sundays, so I'd make my trips Mondays to Saturday. And, we'd always discuss church and discuss Christianity, but it was really always feisty. And, I think one of the positive things coming out of that was that I kept the line of communication open, and we'd sort of argue and fight about it, but we'd talk about it. And I'd challenge my parents on what their choices were, and I never really did get their full story until much later, so now I appreciate what they were looking for more than I did at the time. But in New York, I began to really hunt for how to make sense of my upbringing, this Episcopal experience I had that was so rich, and the Pentecostal experience, and they're all called Christian, and I thought, how can this be, and who are all these people, and what do we come from? And I felt finally after 7 or 8 years in journalism, I wanted to go to graduate school and study theology and maybe become a religion reporter. So that was my impulse. And I couldn't possibly have come out of that without a bias. So I think during the course of my studies at Yale, I discovered that, what I really wanted to do was speak a different kind of voice of Christianity than the one I came out of. So I was really hunting for my own voice when I went to graduate school. And so I came back to faith as a journalist still in my mind, and I wanted to communicate this different kind of Christianity and also discover it and understand it. And when I got to Yale, it was like, when you've been too long in the deep end and you have to get to the surface of the pool to get some air before it's too late. And I felt like that when I walked into my classes and I discovered, ways to articulate that you don't have to take the Bible literally, and there is no rapture theology in the Bible, and there are many revelations I experienced. People, I'm getting a gasp. Yes, there is, but no. It was a tremendous breath of fresh air, to say the very least, to be educated in that way and to learn the scriptures and the context and critical theory and historical criticism and learn Greek and meet other people actually who'd come from a Pentecostal background who were really healthy and had a real wide vision for the world, and learn that there were many ways to express this faith and to live it out. So my conclusion, I guess, of where I am right now, I did become an ordained Episcopal priest, and this path of transformation is long and slow, and I feel that just judging from my very own experience, I'm one person with one heart and one experience, that change really happens one person at a time. And so I feel that the work I do, it's sort of a daily grind sometimes, but my work is involved with people in their daily lives and their highs and lows and their significant moments of baptisms and funerals and weddings. And, it's this one kind of soul at a time, and I have a congregation where I'm every week given the opportunity to engage them with a new way of seeing the world and a new way to interpret their own faith and a new ways to understand the whole point of religion. And I feel that that's my responsibility in my day-to-day life, and that it's a great opportunity. It's not glamorous, and it doesn't, but I think one of my roles there is to put people in the position of having experiences. We do a lot of outreach and justice work, but it's more one-off projects and stuff like that, and I think sometimes those things are dismissed as ineffective and not really systemic change. But in my view, I think they serve the purpose of exposing people to an experience and exposing people to other kinds of stories and lives they wouldn't otherwise encounter, and that little by little, their consciousness can become transformed, and we can more and more see the interconnectedness of each human being. And so it's a very slow unfolding process and story, and it continues in my own life. So that's...
Thank you. Thank you. And before we go to the lightning round, I just want to thank all three panelists for being so open and frank about their journeys. What strikes me remarkably is, there's an Episcopal priest, a Muslim, and a Jew, and yet the language and the experience is really very similar. Which kind of leads me to, I hadn't anticipated this question until hearing all you speak. What is it about the American experience that allows this to happen? What is it that takes such disparate journeys and brings them into a religious community, and I'll use the G word, into a life of devotion in one way or another to God, that we can sit so comfortably on this panel together, where in other countries or in a previous age, it would really be the punchline of a joke to say a rabbi, an Episcopal priest, and a Muslim, sat down together. And it's not a joke at all here. It's a very serious endeavor. So I'd kind of like to hear some 30-second responses to that question. Haroon.
As I said earlier, I have a different conception of time, so I'll define 30 seconds based on my South Asian sense of time. That was a joke. I can have her 30 seconds. See, that's theirs. A Muslim, a Jew, and an Episcopalian start trading time. This is a theoretical physics joke now. I think that with respect to the United States, one of the things that fascinates me, having done a fair amount of work on Muslim communities in Europe, is the extent to which American identity, and I don't by any means want to discount race and ethnicity as key components of the American experience. Nevertheless, religion, I think, becomes a really intriguing marker for American identity in a way it doesn't in other Western countries. So, 150 years ago, there was a German Catholic Church and an Italian Catholic Church, as we've talked about. And I think that the way in which communities transcend their ethnic particulars but retain a religious identity and use it as a means to become American, I think is a really fascinating process. And I think for a lot of Muslims, and people misinterpret this, Islam becomes, in the American context, the means by which they transcend their ethnic or parental identity. So my parents are Pakistani Muslims. I'm not really Pakistani. I don't feel American like the people around me. So I appeal to my religion to define how I can morally and existentially negotiate my identity. And so I figure out what in my religious tradition allows me to become a more functioning part of society, and I think exactly as you said, in a way that retains some form of meaningful identity.
Okay. I'll give either of you the option if you want to pass.
Well, I think, in America we have freedom and safety to speak and to take the time to understand each other, and it doesn't always work out that way, but we do have the space.
So I want to push each of you individually now, questions that dawned on me while I was listening to you, and also from my relationship with you. And I want to start with Melissa. When people hear your story, particularly people in the Jewish community, one of the most remarkable things that you tend to gloss over in the first telling is not that you were engaged with Palestinians, but that you brought Jews of every denomination together. It's kind of like the prerequisite. If you can do that, you can surely, interact with the Palestinians, because we're used to the myth that the American Jewish community is pretty fractious, and we don't all talk to each other, and if we do, we don't always do it nicely. And we're at a point in time in the American Jewish community where that's becoming sometimes more and more difficult. And I know that your own work has brought you to re-engage the American Jewish community in learning how to play nice. Would you like to talk about that for a minute?
Well, I'm sure if I did a kind of asked everyone to raise hands about whether those in the Jewish community in this room, whether you ever felt ill at ease talking about Israel, ever had an antagonistic conversation about Israel, ever avoided a conversation about Israel, many hands would go up. There is tremendous volatility around this issue within the Jewish community. And in some ways, we kind of backed into this work. It was part of the original vision, but it wasn't as integral a part of the original vision of Encounter. We realized that we really couldn't do this work between Jews and Palestinians without also doing this work between Jews and other Jews, which I spoke about a bit. And what's remarkable is the degree to which the skills are entirely transferable. So the ways that people within the Jewish community tend to have tunnel vision about each other, right, around this kind of polarized, entrenched issue, falls along the same kind of conflict patterns of categorical moral judgments and labels and assumptions about each other that we're all swimming in. And I will say that more than one rabbinical student has said that the most important part of their rabbinical education, like the most practical rabbinics that they got, was on an encounter trip, learning our communication agreement and our communication skills. And these are the things that they're going to stick on the walls of their boardrooms, let alone their engagement with people across denominations in their Jewish communities.
Thank you. And Elizabeth, I'm continually fascinated. We tend to have lunch together about once a month and talk about synagogue and church and life in the clergy. So I want to ask you kind of a bold question, which is, do you think that there's a future for the Episcopal Church in America?
It's a good question. If we could have a rabbi like you, we might. I do think there's a future for the Episcopal Church in America, because the Episcopal Church is a place that entertains a lot of questions and a lot of mystery and a lot of openness to science and exploration. And, we pray for babies being baptized that they'll always have the spirit of wonder and discernment and joy in the creation, mystery of creation. And, the underlying, the bedrock of the theology there is one of that we would always have open minds and be discoverers of new truth. And so, I think if we work from that point of view, we do have a future, because I think the world needs a place that's not a place of judgment and exclusion, but a place of, many places of inclusion and embrace, and places that work towards the transformation of consciousness that I was talking about before. That, I think that any good religion worth its while is one that's taking people somewhere new and moving them through, not an end in itself. And I feel at our best, we do that, and we're not always at our best. So if we can sometimes be at our best, we have a future.
And that's why I want to be a member of your church. Haroon, you're going to be the last question, and I'm going to give you a choice of questions. And you can only answer one, okay? So you can either talk about your plans immediately following the completion of your dissertation,
10 years from now.
or if you're willing, because I read his blog, and I know that he's really been reflecting on this a lot, would you be willing to just comment kind of globally on this incredible wave we've been seeing of protest in North Africa and the Arabian Peninsula, and what does it mean? What's going on? You could still answer the doctoral question.
Yeah, right. I think I know more about what's happening than I know with my career. So that certainly says something. I think that, I would say a few things. The first is that the immediate temptation is to compare what's happening right now to Iran. And is this an Islamic revolution? And so I would say a few things. The first is that when Iran's revolution happened, it happened in an era of ideologies, and we forget that. There was still the Cold War, there was still communism, there was still Third World liberation ideology. This was very much an environment in which people were still talking about larger meta-narratives, to use an academic term, that grouped people together into sort of civilizational blocks. The second thing is the Iranian Revolution took a long time, and it was very violent. On one day in the course of the Iranian Revolution, 17,000 people were killed. This is astonishing. To keep that in contrast, the Egyptian Revolution we just saw, 326 people died, which is more people than were killed during the Green Movement protests in Iran after Ahmadinejad's election, in scare quotes, in 2009. So the scale of violence was also different. But I think really, in order to understand what's happening, we need to get a little bit outside the frame of religion, because I think people obsess over the question of Islam and politics. And in the last 30 or 40 years, there's been two trends in the Muslim world. One has been a revival of piety, sort of religious practice on an individual basis, and then there has been political Islam of the violent and nonviolent kind. Political Islam hasn't done very well, by and large. Its only victory, so to speak, was Iran, and that basically sealed its fate, because nobody wants to be in Iran. And the pietistic movement succeeded, where you see this sort of widespread observance of Islamic practice and ritual throughout many Muslim countries. For which reason, religion is not an issue in the revolutions we're seeing, because essentially it's not under threat. When Egyptians look around, they see an environment in which religion is flourishing. The problem isn't religiosity or even anyone attacking religion. The problem is corrupt political systems. And with respect to where this is going, my wife and I, we call this guy Joe the Plumber. If you watch a lot of these YouTube montage videos of the Egyptian Revolution, there's always this guy in the beginning that for some reason everybody loves. He's wearing a big puffy sky blue down jacket, and he just kind of looks like your man of the street, Joe the Plumber of Egypt. And he says, it's very bad for my government. His English is obviously not his first language. And he says, it's very bad for my government. Me and my children, we have nothing. I will die today. And I can tell you on January 26th, when I heard Egyptians on TV in Arabic and then on American TV say, if I go and I die, I don't care, it was over. None of these regimes are going to be able to survive this because people just don't care anymore. They've gotten to a point of frustration, and again, this is not about religion, this is about basic human dignity, a theme you hear over and over and over again. I mean, they tried to deal with it nonviolently in Egypt with Mubarak. That didn't work. Gaddafi tried to literally open fire on it. I mean, it's funny, right? We all thought Mubarak was horrible, then Gaddafi showed up, right? And we're like, wait a minute, right? This guy makes Mubarak look like a pretty nice guy. He used planes on his people, and the people kept fighting. I mean, it's been 9 days, and 80% of Libya is now under rebel control. I mean, this is one of the most brutal dictatorships in an area which is basically run by dictatorships. I mean, most Arab countries are dictatorships of one form or another. And what I really think is happening is fundamentally a realization, whether subconsciously or consciously, that there are 300-something million Arabs in the world. There are about 25% of the world will be Muslim very soon, and yet they make no impact on the world. It's like a vacuum, if you know what I'm saying. I mean, these are societies that had great histories and great potential and that have gone nowhere in the last 50 years, by and large. And a lot of people, I think, when the realization hits them, the sense of massive failure, it creates this wave. And I mean, just thinking about it, it's still astonishing to me. I mean, Tunisia, January 14th, Mubarak, February 11th. February 16th, Gaddafi starts by detaining a human rights lawyer. February 17th is the date of the first protest. By February 22nd, most of the east of the country is now under rebel control. And now it's happening in Oman, in Mauritania, in Djibouti, in Yemen, in Bahrain, in all these different countries. And I think fundamentally it is people waking up in a democratic sense. And that is not to say that we know where it's going to go or that everything will go well, but I think that people feel let down, whether that is with secular dictatorship or religious dictatorship. And I think in that sense it's a very good thing, and it's something we should be amazed by. But it really remains to be seen whether in this period of transition people can retain that original spirit of solidarity and find something, a political system that reflects who they are.
Well, thank you. Thank you, because all three of you have just given us enormous food for thought, both in your open frankness in modeling your own journeys. I feel fairly certain, looking around the room and knowing some of the people in the audience, that you've set people to thinking about what their own paths are, and you've set them thinking, I think, in very positive ways. But each of you has given us insights that we didn't have. I would be remiss in my job as the director of the Finkelstein Institute if I didn't share with you some of our upcoming programs. So I'm going to do that now. On March the 17th, we're very proud to be doing a bioethics program called Children of Abraham, Jewish, Christian, and Muslim Views on Stem Cell Research and Shaping Public Policy. That's on March the 17th. There will be a flyer downstairs for you if you want to pick it up. On April the 6th, the Finkelstein Institute and a whole bunch of other institutions are delighted to be sponsoring the New York premiere of a documentary film called John Muir in the New World. It's going to be aired on public television for Earth Day, but we're doing it here as a preview on April the 6th at 7 p.m. And on April the 12th, the Archbishop of New York, who is also the president of the United States Conference of Catholic Bishops, will be here at the Jewish Theological Seminary talking about Catholic-Jewish relations beyond a dialogue of grievances. And when Archbishop Dolan has finished his talk, he will engage in dialogue with our Chancellor, Arnold Eisen. So we have a number of exciting programs still to come. But wait, there's more. Because now I'm going to invite all of you to join us. The band is going to play a set for us. The band is called Girls in Trouble for a very simple reason. All the songs that you will hear in this set, all the songs on the eponymous CD, are about women of the Bible, hence Girls in Trouble. Alicia Jo Ravens earned her master's degree here at JTS in the Women's Studies program, and her master's thesis was the song cycle. And I'm very, very excited to have them. We're going to first thank our panel. And I have the assurance of the panelists that they will be hanging out for a while with us downstairs so that you'll have the chance to engage them directly. But if we go out the stairway here, you'll go directly down into the JTS cafeteria. I invite you to grab a snack, find a table, and at about 8:54 and 16 seconds, give or take a few, the band is going to play about a half-hour set for us. And then you'll have a chance to hang out, network, schmooze, whatever your religious community calls that. So please join us downstairs. Thank you.